Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you for that introduction, and welcome to today's version of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien, and once again, I would like to say at the very beginning what a pleasure it is to be with you today, as it is every day. I've got to say very honestly that I spend a good portion of the day before we actually come on the air thinking about, looking forward to this experience. I am thoroughly enjoying this. I trust, I hope that many of you are as well. So it bothers me sometimes, very honestly, and I've shared this with my good friend Bob Kincaid about calls. I really sometimes wish that there were more calls, and I'm a little bit concerned because traditionally, when you don't get, my experience in the classroom is that when you don't get the response from students, it could be for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons sometimes is that you're not making yourself clear, or you're not emotionally connecting with the students to the point that they feel the need for, or the need to, or desire to engage the material themselves. And I have to hope that that's not true, because if that engagement isn't there, then I'm not at all succeeding. So I thank you. I appreciate the fact that you are with us here on the Head On Radio Network for today's session of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I appreciate the fact that many of you have returned, which means you have been here today. I'm guessing that there may be some folks out there listening who have never been here before, and I invite you to give us a try and stay with us for a while, and feel free to come back. We're doing this for 2 hours each afternoon, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, live on the Head On Radio Network, and it is interactive. There is a phone number, and I would love to hear from you, because not hearing from folks day to day kind of gives you the impression that you're doing this for no purpose. So, I do encourage you to pick up the phone and share your ideas and your perceptions and your comments or criticisms or just observations on some of the issues we're talking about, or ways that perhaps they connect to other issues, which I'm not, sharp enough to think about. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to email me personally, I would welcome that. I would appreciate it, and I promise that I will respond to you, and I'll do the very best I can to respond in kind, if I can. And by in kind, what I mean is, if you take the time to put together your thoughts and send me an email, then I owe you at least as much time and thought in a response. And I will commit to you that I will make every effort to do that. In fact, I received an email from one of our listeners, and I didn't get a chance to look at it until 45 minutes before we were due to go on the air. And I sent an email to the listener, the person who submitted this, and told him that his request was that I take a look at this issue. And I told him that I would do that, but it would have to wait until after today's program, because I didn't want to confuse myself. My head was starting to, the stars were starting to line up, as it were, and I kind of had a feeling that I knew where I was going to start and where I hoped I would go today, and and it was so close to airtime that I thought it would be better if I just held off and waited until after we're off the air this evening, or even in the morning tomorrow, before I looked at that particular issue. But I told in my answer, my reply, I told the person who sent me the email, who sent me the site, that I would do that, and I will. And I appreciate very much the fact that the person who sent it wanted to share this with me and was interested in my spin on the particular issue. I don't know what that spin is because I'm not totally familiar with the issue as yet. But if I feel that I can say something substantive, I will, and if I can, I'll say that too. But I appreciate the emails. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN, not ANEN, 906 at gmail.com. WAObrien 906 at gmail.com. A couple of comments about yesterday's program, and I believe I mentioned yesterday that I was scheduled to present a program to our Rotary Club at lunch today here in Beckley, West Virginia, and I did that. And I presented the course. I think we did a program on this a few weeks ago about this course that I was going to offer area high school students this fall. And I mentioned that the Rotary Board, our local Rotary Club, had not only endorsed the program, but had agreed that Rotary would subsidize the tuition of every student who registered for it up to 50%, depending on what the exact tuition would happen to be. And what I did commit to the board was that I would do the best I could to get the best tuition deal for students that I could. And today, because I was asked to do the program for the meeting, half-hour program, which I did on this particular program, on that course and what its intent was, why I was doing it, what I wanted to do, what I wanted to do, and why I wanted to do it, what I hoped the results would be. And to be honest with you, I'm a little bit high right now because the response was much more positive than even I dared hope. The club members of the club seemed to be particularly interested in the program. I spent some time with them talking about the need for the program and the fact that, and I was using some hard data, but the fact that so many of our young people begin college but never finish. And I'm talking about a majority. And I mentioned, in my own case, I spent 22 years with Concord University here in southern West Virginia. And I mentioned that our recruitment, our freshman class, each fall over the 21, 22 years that I've been here, numbers anywhere from 750 students to 825 students or something like that every fall. Yet our graduation, our group of graduates declines by quite a bit less than that. Our graduation, numbers of students graduating on the average year will be 300, 310, something like that. So what I'm basically suggesting is we're losing 500 of the 800 students that we admit as freshmen every year. Every year. And this is not a criticism of Concord University because these numbers are pretty solid no matter what college or university you look at. And the way we judge our percentages, for example, is we report the students who graduate within 6 years after they first enroll. In other words, we give them 6 years to complete a 4-year program. That gives them time to change their major or retake courses that they didn't do as well as they wanted to, or whatever they might do. So we're giving them 6 years to complete. And our graduation rate is well below 40. I mean, our graduation rate is well below 40%. In other words, we're probably looking at a 37% graduation rate. And other schools in the state are maybe a little bit lower than that, maybe a little bit higher than that. But the point I'm trying to make is this is pretty much standard stuff. And so what that says is a college education is not for the bulk of the people we're recruiting. The thing that bothers me the most is that a number of these students that we admit as freshmen don't even make it through the first year. In fact, a significant percentage of them don't even come back for the second semester. And this is not, again, a criticism of Concord University. This exists in many other places. We'll lose 8 to 10% of our entering freshman class the first semester. Don't even return for the start of the second semester after the Christmas holidays. And by the end of the first year, if we look at the start of the fall semester in the second year, when these students would be sophomores, most years we've already lost 20-25% of the students that we admitted the year before. Maybe more than that. I'm not, that number I'm not really sure about. So this says a lot about the students, but it also says a lot about higher education and what we're doing. And obviously, we're not meeting the needs of an awful lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And so the program that I'm proposing is designed principally, hopefully, to address at least one and possibly more than one of those reasons. That, you know, many of our students are not sophisticated. Maybe that's a very vague term, and I think I need to explain that. But it's very important. We're not, you know, we're in West Virginia. Most of the students that we admit are first-generation college students. They come from families where nobody in their immediate family has ever gone to college before. This is, over the 140 years that Concord's been in existence, this is a badge that Concord wears proudly, is that over the years, through the decades, we have been able to attract a substantial number of first-generation students from a part of the country where college education for most young people is not in the plan at all. And so we've done some pretty noble things. And I think that's very significant. But because many of our students are first-generation students, they do not have the background, or they do not come from the kind of an environment which makes college-level work something that they're used to or comfortable with, or that they even know in many cases. The fact of the matter is many of our students are out of the race before, you know, once we leave the starting gate for the start of the fall semester. This is a metaphor. Many of our students are out of the race by the time they reach the first term, if that makes sense, because they are so unprepared. I mean, and I told the group today about, I've actually done this. I've asked whole classes of students on the first day, how many of you have ever taken a written so-called essay exam? How many of you have ever been asked your opinion on anything and been graded for it? In a history class or in a social science class of any kind, government, sociology, psychology, whatever. And more often than not, it's pretty paltry. Probably 25% sometimes on an average, I would say. Most of our high schools do not expose their students to writing, let alone to extensive reading and to critical thinking. And so if these students register for classes that require those skills, the reality is that there's only going to be a small proportion of the entering freshman class that's going to even know what those skills are. And if the courses they enter require those skills, then 2 out of every 3 of our students is dead in the water before the game even starts. And so that's one of the, as I shared with the group today, that's one of the issues that I wanted to take on. I really want the students who go through this program to know exactly what going to college means, the kinds of things they're going to be asked to do, but more important, how to do them. I don't want our students to fail, ostensibly because they couldn't do something, when in fact they didn't even know what it was that they were supposed to be able to do. And that's what I'm tailoring the course for. But the point that I wanted to share, so I'm because the response was pretty powerful for me. It was pretty. I was flying, very honestly. I felt very good about the idea and about the proposal, because the members of the club seemed to be very enthusiastic as well. And just to show you that nothing is, that everything, to a certain degree, most of the things that I do is, are works in progress. One of the members of the club raised the issue and said, I see a possibility for interested Rotarians to really become involved in this program. For example, if you have a lot of students enrolled in this course, then you're going to need people to help you read essays, help you read papers. We Rotarians, many of us are retired, not most of them, but probably half of them. Many of us are retired, and we could easily read the essays of 5 students. So if you give an assignment, you ought to be able to find 5 or 6 of us who are more than willing to read 5 papers and just read. We don't have to grade them on content. Just grade them on, this particular essay is not written well, it doesn't make sense, you don't seem to understand what the question was, or, just general comments, or it's a good job or not a good job or whatever. We've got a lot of people in our club who are retired professional people who could do this with one arm tied behind them, so to speak. And so what this particular member of the club did, a good friend of mine, by the way, he got me all excited, because I thought, my God, this is a way that we can enlist a lot of Rotarians and let them become partners in this endeavor. It's not just a program that they hear about during Rotary meetings. It's a program that they actually participate in and feel like they can make a meaningful contribution to. I got excited about that. And I still am excited about that. But what I wanted to share with you was that I was thinking to myself, probably, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so to speak. And I thought, maybe if I give these folks an example of what I'm talking about, by talking about the students it'll be a course that will focus exclusively on primary sources. And what I did is I brought a copy of the Jefferson letter to Lafayette on leadership that we talked about in yesterday's program. And I shared it with this group today. And that really got some attention. Because basically what I was saying is, if you give students a piece of primary material like this and ask them to make meaning from it, to draw meaning from it, to read between the lines, or what is this about? What is Jefferson doing? What kind of a relationship is he establishing here with Lafayette? And you ask those kinds of questions, students have the making in this one paragraph of an entire essay. And when you make them aware, when you let them know that when they do this, they are practicing historians. They are writing interpretive history. They are basically taking a thesis which they create, and they are telling the reader where it came from and the support for it. In other words, why, if this is advice on leadership, Jefferson never mentions the word leadership in the essay. So on what basis could you say that Jefferson is giving the younger Lafayette first-hand advice on how to be an effective leader? Where's your evidence for that in this quote? And you could play with this one paragraph for 2 or 3 days with students, and you could basically show them how to extract meaning, how to take an interpretive position on a piece of historical evidence, how to draw from the paragraph that you have before you the supporting evidence that you need for the thesis that you formulated, and on and on and on. You could teach a substantial portion of a literature course from this one paragraph. But even better than that, and that's what makes this so exciting, is once students have done this 3 times, 4, depending on the student. Sometimes some students only need to do this once, and they just take off and run with it, and they don't need you anymore. But most students can't do that. And so they'd need they'd have to do this a couple of times, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times. It doesn't matter. But the point is, if you put together a course like this one is envisioned for an entire year, and you give students opportunity to do this again and again and again, once they get it, once they see the kinds of questions that lead one to be able to extract meaning from historical content, once you show them how to defend a point of view, once you expose them to the fact that different people looking at the same paragraph will come up with rather different interpretive essays about that paragraph. In other words, they'll see different things, or they'll emphasize different things. And what that's going to realize is that when you're writing interpretive history like this, there's no right answers and wrong answers. That your interpretation is as good as your ability to back it up with evidence. And if you show people how to do that, and you give them enough opportunities to practice it, then at the end of the experience, however long it takes to basically sink in, so to speak, you have given students the keys to the kingdom. There are different levels of this depending on which institutions you might end up in. But the fact of the matter is, once you know how to do this, then the decision as to whether college is for you or not is yours to make. You're not going to be denied the possibility of reaching your career objectives or plans because somebody's telling you that you're not capable, or you're not qualified, or you just don't have the right stuff, or whatever the terms are that people use to bring the bad news, so to speak. The point that I feel makes this so very exciting is that at some level, to some degree, everybody can do this. Because everybody can think. Even the people that don't read well. Heck, you read it to them. Verbally read it to them. They can understand it. And they can basically formulate questions and potential thesis statements from what they hear. The point I'm trying to make is that if it becomes clear that a particular student has something substantive to contribute to the discussion, even if that student is not a good reader, what better incentive to learn how to read better than a number of other people who are eager to hear what you think about a particular topic? How many students in our education system have never, ever been in that, have never experienced that, where anybody cared what they think about anything? Now you've got a group of student classmates, colleagues, who have told you that what you have to offer is worth listening to, is worth considering. They don't know that you have problems reading and understanding what you read. They don't know that critical reading is not one of your strengths. They don't know that the reason you were able to do this is because you heard it, even though you couldn't personally read it. But you are free to improve your craft. In other words, the opportunity there is golden to improve your reading skills. And what I plan to tell every student going into this, I can't promise you that every student who goes through this course is going to be accepted at Harvard. I can't say that. I don't believe that. But what I can say, and what I will say, is that every student who goes through this experience will read better at the end than they did at the beginning. Not only that, I could also say that however you write, whether you're a good writer or a not good writer, I can commit to the fact that by going through this experience, you will end up writing better than you do now. You will be turning out work at the end that you couldn't have even thought about doing at the very beginning. Whether it's enough to satisfy you, whether it's enough to suggest to you that you really ought to seriously consider college or university education, I don't know. That's your call. But the point is that the decision will be yours. And I'm getting a little bit linking up here with the founders a little bit, but I can't help it. The whole idea of equality of opportunity in our society is based on the fact that people get a fair shot. Nobody's guaranteeing that everybody's going to experience the same level of success, because we know they're not. But all we can do is do the best we can to make sure that everybody has a fair shot. And I would argue that many students who are entering our colleges are not being given a fair shot. And I think the numbers that I quoted earlier about the numbers who enter as freshmen and never graduate, I think those numbers alone speak to the fact that we have, in many cases, not just the particular institution I'm connected with, but colleges everywhere, have virtually become revolving door situations where we let them in the front end and we run them through and out the back end. They never graduate. They leave without an education. They leave without a degree. Chances are, however, they'll leave with some pretty substantial debt. We've got to get our arms around this. We've got to get a handle on this. And I'm hoping that we can do it. And the fact that I have today the support of our local Rotary Club to do it, I'm very excited. I can't wait to get started. We're going to be doing this fall, and I'm very, very excited about it. You probably can pick that up a little bit, because I know we did a program on this before, but I'm very excited. And I wanted to share with you the reaction to the Jefferson document, because many of the folks really thought that made perfect sense. Because in fact, one of them made the comment to me and said, if you read Jefferson, he's talking about one thing, and when you started talking about leadership, I basically said this is what Jefferson's doing. And everything that I said about the document, Jefferson didn't say in words. But the fact of the matter is that's what he was talking about. And that's meaning that I brought to that particular document by the way I interpreted it. And once students experience that, once students experience education, what is the old, the old cliche that people use, the first aha, the first time you see those eyes light up, you know that good things have happened. Most students never experience that, so they don't even know what it's about. It's kind of, if you've ever been a jogger or a runner, it's kind of like the high. The high that you get after you reach, you go a certain distance. If you've never gone that distance, then you don't know what the high is. If you're a jogger, most of the time, I used to have to probably exceed 1.5 miles. By the time I got to 1.5 miles, 1.75 miles, 2 miles, I started to experience the high. And it's pretty exciting. It's pretty infectious. But if you've never done it at all, or you can't go more than a half a mile, then you've never had the chance to experience the high. And if you've never really had an educational experience that was positive for you, I would suggest the high is equally high. And I'm talking to the choir here because many of the people who are tuned into this program I know very well know exactly what I'm talking about, or you wouldn't even be here. So I'm very excited, and I've so far had a good day, and I'm very appreciative of it, and I wanted to share my enthusiasm and my good tidings with you, and I appreciate. In fact, I took a half an hour of our time doing that. So, and if you remember yesterday, we were looking at the syllabus for this course on leadership. We were talking about leadership, and I had shared with you from the syllabus a number of statements or a number of quotations about different people, contemporary people, and what they've said about leadership and the difference between leadership and management and all the rest of it. And of course, the quote that sticks with most folks and stuck with me is the Jefferson quote. But I wanted to share just a couple of others before we get off this, because we talked an awful lot about Jefferson and about his quotation yesterday and his statement about leadership and the idea. You'll notice that we didn't go into all of this detail, but I believe we did make this point, that as Jefferson is speaking to Lafayette in this statement, he's not suggesting that you go to the people and you let them decide what you do as their leader. That's not what we're talking about at all. That's not what Jefferson's talking about at all. What Jefferson is talking about is the interaction and the communication between leader and the people being led. And his basic premise is, if you don't know where the people are coming from that you profess to lead, then how can you be an effective and good leader? And once you become leader, you can't ask them because they won't be honest with you. They'll play to the crowd. I mean, they'll say, well, the prince or the king or whatever asked me a question. I'm going to say whatever he wants to hear. So what Jefferson is saying is, in order to do this effectively, you got to do it before they know who you are, so that effectively you can be in disguise. You can be, as he says, incognito, where you sit down, you break bread with them, you talk about them, you lay on their beds, you lift up the cover and look into the kettle of vegetables and all the rest of it. And as far as they know, you're just hungry or you're tired or whatever, depending on what you do. But as Jefferson says, what you're really doing is you're learning about them, what it is they need, what it is they want, what their priorities are. And then you, as the leader, knowing that, make the decision as to what would be best for these folks. Would it be best to give them what we want? Is it, from your perspective as leader, which means you've got a level of education, preparation, and training and all the rest of it, which makes you able to lead but others not so, then you make the decision. Are there negatives to what they want that they don't even understand or appreciate? Are there reasons why they shouldn't get what they want or what they think they need? Then if there are, then it becomes very, very important that you spend the necessary time educating them on why what they want or what they need is not really what they ought to have. So you maintain the ultimate decision, the power to make the final decision. But in order for them to respect your right to make it, they have to know that you know where they're coming from. They have to know that you have their best interest at heart. They have to trust you to be able to make the right kinds of decisions for them. And if there is that back and forth and that trust, then even if you end up denying them what they thought they wanted, and you've done the foundation work, you've basically laid the groundwork for that particular decision, that particular no, then they're not going to resent it for it. They'll probably, in the long term, appreciate you for the wisdom that you brought to that particular issue. So Jefferson's not talking about a surrender here of power from the leader to the led. He's talking about informed leadership. He's talking about what Montesquieu talked about in terms of why a republic needed to be small. Because only then could the leader and the led have the kind of interaction and communication that is necessary to make a republic successful. That's what Montesquieu believed. Madison argued obviously something different. He talked about the larger sphere and the multiplicity, the diversity of different factions and interest groups. And paraphrasing Madison here, you make it unlikely that there will be a majority. And if there isn't a majority, then you make the decision. The only time that the leader loses the power to make the ultimate decision is when there is an effective majority. Because by definition, majorities make the rules, make the decisions. So Madison's strategy is you need to organize the constituency in such a way that there's never a majority. Or even if there is one, it's so spread out that the people who are part of it don't even know that they're part of a majority. And until it organizes and begins to function, it doesn't exist. And so from Madison's perspective, if the majority is not making the decisions, and that's Madison's whole point, he doesn't want the majority to make the decisions because they're not capable, then the alternative to that is that the minority is making the decisions. Somebody is making decisions. And if it's not the majority, then it must be the minority. And thus you have Madison's thinking on the Constitution of the United States. Do we have a caller?
No caller, Bill. We now rejoin Dr. Bill O'Brien and the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States, already in progress. Here's Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and I apologize for that interruption, but apparently somebody's hacking into our system, and I didn't quite know how to respond, so I basically had to hang up and reconnect. So I apologize for that. But basically, what we were talking about was the whole issue of leadership. We were talking specifically about Jefferson's advice to Lafayette and what it was and what it wasn't. It involved interaction and communication between leaders and followers, but it did not constitute a surrender of the right to make decisions to the followers. And if you recall, and I know we went into this some weeks ago, Edmund Burke's distinction between the representative as delegate and the representative as trustee. And Burke makes that point very well, that it's very important that the leader be in communication with those that he or she is leading. But that doesn't necessitate the surrender of one's power as leader to the group you are leading. And that's Burke's point. And that's Jefferson's point. With that, let me share with you another, not very long, quotation on the same issue. And we can speculate a little bit about this. To link oneself with the masses, one must act in accordance with the needs and wishes of the masses. There are two principles here. One is the actual needs of the masses rather than what we fancy they need. And the other is the wishes of the masses, who must make up their own minds instead of our making up their minds for them. We should pay close attention to the well-being of the masses, from the problems of land to those of fuel, rice, cooking oil, and salt. We should help them to proceed from these things to an understanding of the higher tasks which we have put forward. Such is the basic method of leadership. Author, Chairman Mao Zedong, 1943. So very similar to what Jefferson is saying. Yet, if you, and I'm being a little bit contemporary here, if you were to go so far as to start quoting Chairman Mao in a history class with students, you would be on thin ice. So I think what we have to appreciate here is the symmetry that exists between the content. But what really differentiates those two paragraphs is that Thomas Jefferson authored one, Mao Zedong authored the other. Once you make that clear, then people's reaction becomes totally different to one over the other. I would suggest to you that knowing the author of each of these paragraphs pretty much dictates what the reaction is going to be to the content. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't have a whole lot to do with content, because the content's pretty much the same. Pretty much. And so I make reference back to the article we looked at yesterday, the research that was done in the recent New York Times article entitled "Where We Are Shapes Who We Are." Who writes a particular point of view oftentimes determine how we react to it, not what it says. And I think that's something we all need to understand and appreciate. Because chances are we're missing an awful lot of substantive meaning and content. We're losing a lot of value because we're kind of programmed to look favorably on certain authors and unfavorably on others. And what that does, and this is me speaking here now, this is all off the top, so to speak. I'm not reading from anybody. This is my own stuff. But I did want to make these points because I think this issue is very, very important. It basically suggests that our ability to read critically suffers in part because we are so pre-programmed to respond positively or negatively to who authors a particular position. Not what it says, but whose position it is. And the more of our education background that is focused in that direction, the less substantively are our skills going to develop. The less substantively do we trust ourselves to interpret a piece of literature or a piece of history and make the appropriate and draw the appropriate conclusions and make the appropriate decisions from them. We are letting the author determine our reaction, determine our decisions, rather than our own ability to read and think and understand and interpret. The students in the most challenging, rigorous academic environments, most of the time, functioned beyond that level. Because chances are that the so-called the best students, the very high ACT and SAT scoring students, chances are going to be in educational environments where they are put on notice right at the very beginning that you need to read these things, you need to think about these things, you need to understand these things, you need to feel comfortable interpreting these things and agreeing here and disagreeing there and all the rest of it. In other words, we want you to become a decision maker, a leader. And that means that you need to deal with content and substance in a constructive way. And you cannot fall victim to making your decision about a particular issue or item or paragraph or whatever it is. You can't make your decision based on whose name appears at the front of it or at the tail end of it, who said it, who wrote it, whatever. And that's really, in microcosm, I think, where the deficiencies in our educational system lie. We have got to appreciate the fact that every one of our kids, every student can think and reason to a degree. Now, I'm not saying everybody can do it equally because they can't. There are some students that will never be able to perform at the same level as other students. That doesn't mean that they cannot be and do not deserve the opportunity to be educated. What we need to do is figure out where they are and then basically figure out how far we can take them. Education can work for everybody. It's the balancer. It's the factor that balances all of this. It's the issue that makes education, equality of opportunity, meaningful and possible. Not likely necessarily, but possible. And what we need to do is not spend our time denying vast majority of our students the opportunities to do this because they can't perform at a particular level. The fact of the matter is all of our students could perform if we show them what to do and how to do it. Maybe all not at the same level. But all students can think and write and reason and read and analyze and interpret and evaluate and rank and make judgments and all the other skills we talk about. And if you think about today's world of employment, what in heaven's name are employers asking for but those things? They want students who can learn. They don't want students who have already learned, because there's no way in the world they could until they actually get to the particular work circumstance that they're going to be working in. But they want students who have learned how to learn. They want students who can adjust to change, who are not programmed to respond to particular cues, like who's the author of this quote, or who wrote this poem, or something like that. We give that kind of education to those left after we cull out the majority as being incapable of engaging in that kind of an experience. Yet we are rapidly moving into a world where we've got to begin to educate everybody, not just a few. And we have got to basically commit to the idea that everybody can experience success. And once we do that, I think we'll overcome a lot of our problems. I think that the Mao quote, in light of the Jefferson quote, is very, very revealing. Because if you don't mention Mao, it almost seems like somebody saying the same thing Jefferson said. I would be remiss. We're at 54 minutes after the hour, so as we approach the top of our first hour, the end of our first hour, I would be remiss if I didn't share with you the leadership quote from Machiavelli, because everybody loves Machiavelli. If you've ever been in a classroom situation, in a classroom setting, there's never an opportunity pass that when Machiavelli is introduced, it gets discussion. And is it the fact that Machiavelli's writing is so profoundly deep, or is it the fact that Machiavelli says what many of us think anyway? He seems to put into words what many of us have difficulty doing. And I think this one is one that many of us can probably relate to. This is from The Prince, and it's not long at all. A prince will never lack for legitimate excuses to explain away his breaches of faith. If you are going to be a successful leader, the prince, so to speak, then one thing you need to understand, he is saying, is that you will never lack legitimate excuses in order to explain away his breaches of faith. Modern history will furnish innumerable examples of this behavior, showing how the man succeeded best who knew how best to play the fox. The person succeeds best who knows best how to play the fox. But it is a necessary part of this nature, Machiavelli says, that you must conceal it carefully. You can't let people know and admit to being a fox. So you've got to conceal it. You must be a great liar and hypocrite. Men are so simple of mind and so much dominated by their immediate needs that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived. That last sentence is worth a reread. Men are so simple of mind and so much dominated by their immediate needs that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived. so goes Machiavelli's advice on leadership. This is the exact opposite of the optimism in Jefferson and Mao, by the way. This kind of is a taste of cynicism. People are so dominated by their immediate needs that if you play your cards right, they're asking you to deceive them. Don't disappoint them, Machiavelli saying to the prince. Don't disappoint them and you'll be fine. You can understand why students will jump all over Machiavelli. It's absolutely wonderful stuff. And I just think that this whole leadership issue is an important one because, and again, this is the way to bring this to a conclusion, because all of it is driven by the particular context within which we're talking about. If the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution is about one thing, it's about the political environment which exists in this country, where it came from and why it's structured the way it is, what the architects of it, the founders, really believed they were doing, and why they thought that way. And the point I'm trying to make is that in order to come up with a meaningful definition of leadership, you have to do it within that context. And that's why the textbook that I mentioned yesterday by James McGregor Burns is the way to go. This guy is schooled in the internal operations of this particular political system. And within that context, within what he knows so well, his ideas and his thinking on leadership probably carries a little bit more weight than everybody else's. And let me bring this hour to an end, if I can, by sharing with you an absolutely wonderful piece of writing. This is from a play written in 1721 entitled Cato, a Tragedy. It's the stage version of Cato's letters in the 18th century. The author of this play was Addison. Addison's tragedy, entitled Cato, a Tragedy, 1721. Because in it, we see the optimism of the Roman Republic, which so many of the founders went to. Much of their idealism was based on this kind of idealism. The following appears in Act 1 of Addison's play. A Roman soul is bent on higher views, to civilize the rude, unpolished world, and lay it under the restraint of laws, to make man mild and sociable to man. To cultivate the wild, licentious savage with wisdom, discipline, and liberal arts, the embellishments of life. Virtues like these make human nature shine, reform the soul, and break our fierce barbarians into men. If there is a more positive, optimistic statement of what we are capable of doing to others, it's this particular poem from the Cato play. The idea of the Roman Republic has higher goals, higher views, significant aspirations, and they are to civilize the rude, unpolished world and bring all of it under the restraint of laws, to make man mild and sociable to other men, create an environment where men can really get along with other men, to cultivate the wild, licentious savage with wisdom, discipline, and liberal arts, the embellishments of life. It's virtues like these, Addison says, that make human nature shine, that reform the soul, and that break our fierce barbarians into men. Over the years and all the reading that I've done about liberal arts education and why I believe in it so passionately, I've had a number of people on a number of occasions ask me what the liberal arts is about, what a liberal education is, what does a liberal education do, how is it different from any other kind of education. And the answer that over the last few years, the answer that I have come to giving more often than not is the following. The idea of a liberal arts education is to teach people how to be human. Education is the key to separating human beings from all other forms of life. We are human beings because we have brains and souls, because we think and understand and care, because we laugh and because we cry, and because we can emotionally connect with other people. And the result of a whole group, a whole way of life, a whole community of people whose principal objective is to go the extra mile to get along with the other people. Not get one foot up on them or one leg up on them or outdo them or anything else, but to find a way to enrich and enjoy and appreciate our fellow man, all of us, creatures of one Creator. To me, that's what a good education is about. That's what John Adams and some of the other founders believed that a liberal arts education was about. He believed it was like a badge. The people who had it became very visible. You knew who the educated people were. It is not an accident at every graduation and every college that I've been connected with that at some point the president of the college or university will say to the graduates, "Welcome to the world of educated people. You are now an educated person." And that's something very, very special. Because the whole idea is that's what makes us human. This poem says it. The founders believed it. They may have been overly optimistic, as the movement towards the Constitution suggested. But I think that we probably have made an incredible mistake when so many of us have lost so much of that idealism. Let's kind of call it there, shall we? It's 7 minutes after the hour. Let's break for 4 or 5 minutes and kind of stretch and get a chance to reflect on that. Then we'll come back and we'll start talking about something quite a bit different. I'm Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. You are tuned in to the Head On Radio Network. We welcome you. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. This is Bill O'Brien back with you at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. Our phone number, we invite you to participate actively in our program. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333, 304-658-3333. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I wanted to kind of shift gears in our second hour and get off the leadership issue a little bit and go on to something else. And I've actually got two issues here. One relates to the constitutional questions that are revolving around the whole country today over the National Security Administration surveillance of emails and phone calls and cell phones and all the rest of it. The revelations brought to our attention through the information gathered by Edward Snowden and the reactions to it. We spent quite a bit of time on that last week, and I don't want to go back and rehash all the issues, but there's one I think particularly powerful job on this particular issue that I think all of us ought to be familiar with, and I wanted to share that with folks today. But before that, I wanted to go back into the 18th century a little bit on a totally different issue, and I was pouring through. I've finished reading the book that we talked about at the end of last week by Jürgen Heideking on the Constitution. Before the Judgment Seat is the title. The Prehistory and Ratification of the American Constitution. And I shared with you a little bit of Heideking's background last week and the connection he had with the federal project on the papers for the ratification papers, documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, John Kaminsky and Rich Leffler's program, and Heideking's original contact with Merrill Jensen and all of it. We went through all of that. But in going back over, and I've made extensive comments in the margins and various other things. If you read my book, it's the books that I read. I just mark them up something awful. But one of the questions that I thought it's not worthy of an entire program necessarily, but one of the issues that I thought everybody would find revealing and interesting both is a little piece of information that would be so easy to just let go and not even recognize it or not even see it or not. I've made reference numerous times on our program to so-and-so's letters to somebody else. Jefferson's letter to Madison, or Madison's letters back to Jefferson, or Madison's letter to Washington, or Rufus King's letter to Washington, or whatever. And I usually give the dates of them. And what I pointed out more than once is that these people, the so-called founders, these people communicated extensively. They wrote often, and they wrote elegantly. It's a lost art, I think. And through the process of the ratification of the Constitution, John Kaminsky, Rich Leffler, Merrill Jensen, and all the people involved in it have been able to pull together all of these primary documents and letters and everything else. And they've published them. At this point, they've published about 23 volumes. And as I mentioned, as a result of our PRISM program, we were able to get access to the University of Virginia's Rotunda Project, which effectively means that by going through Concord University's library and gaining access to Rotunda, our teachers have been given access to all of the papers that exist so far, the edited papers of Madison and Jefferson and Washington and Hamilton and all the rest of them. That's really what the Rotunda Project is about. And Congress's goal in Rotunda was to make these papers, these primary source materials, as available as possible to as many American citizens as possible. I would suggest to you that's really what the whole idea of the Virtual Center is about, is to do the same thing. But one of the issues that historians write about all the time during this period, especially when they talk about support for the Constitution as opposed to its opponents, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, not only who they were, but what the advantages of the Federalists the advantages that the Federalists had over the Anti-Federalists. There's no question that it's generally acknowledged that the Federalists had most of the advantage in this campaign because they were better organized. They were much more in communication with each other. They were much better able to produce, to design, and implement strategy. They became a team. They knew what they wanted, and they shared opinions and ideas on how best to get it. It took the Anti-Federalists much longer to get that kind of an operation underway. And so the Federalists had a tremendous advantage over the Anti-Federalists. And almost every textbook will make that point because I think it's significant. There's absolutely no question that the Federalists, in terms of political organization and communication, had the advantage. Back to Heideking. Heideking has a short section in his book. It actually begins on page 100. In a section he's entitled National Correspondence. Heideking obviously is aware, in doing his research, as to how much in communication these founders were, these framers of the Constitution were. But he's gone the extra step that nobody that I ever saw ever took the time to do before. He basically gives us the numbers. And in about 2.5 pages of his text, Heideking lays out who wrote to whom how many times. Not only do we know that Jefferson and Madison wrote to each other frequently, but Heideking tells us how many times, how many exchanges there were. I thought it would be very interesting and informative to just share some of this information with you today. It won't take long, but I think it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. There's no question that a key to all of this communication, all this letter writing, is George Washington. In fact, Heideking says that one letter writer, he's talking about the letter writers among the national correspondents, one letter writer stands head and shoulders above the rest, he says, and he wasn't even a member of Congress, but the commander-in-chief during the War for Independence, and he was president of the Federal Convention, George Washington. And then he has a quote from Washington after he returns home from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And he begins to work tirelessly to get ratification of the Constitution through. On the 24th of September, 1787, and we know that the convention ended on the 17th. So this is the 24th. This is a week later, after the close of the convention. Washington wrote a letter to 3 former Virginia governors. And basically, he sends them not only his thinking, but he sends them drafts of the Constitution, which was just approved the week before. And this is what Washington says in this letter to Virginia's governors. I wish the Constitution which is offered had been made more perfect, but I sincerely believe it is the best that could be obtained at this time. And as a constitutional door is open for amendment hereafter, the adoption of it under present circumstances of the Union is, in my opinion, desirable. So here's George Washington, the most prominent person in 18th century America, endorsing the Constitution of the United States a week after the convention closed. Now, his Hiding Kings research. Between September 1787 and March 1789, Washington sent 137 different letters to 66 different people in which he talked about the strengths of the Constitution. 137 letters to 66 different people. He wrote to people in 11 of the 13 states, as well as people in France and Great Britain. Heideking points out that Washington had especially close contacts with James Madison, to whom Washington wrote 17 letters, and from whom he received 43 letters by the end of 1789. If you look at Madison's letters and the length of them, this is incredible. Madison wrote Washington 43 different times between the close of the convention and the end of 1789. Other prominent people who are involved in this transmission of letters back and forth about the Constitution. Washington sent 20 letters, exchanged 20 letters with General Benjamin Lincoln in Boston between the spring of 1788 and 1789, in 1 year during ratification. Washington wrote Lincoln 20 times and sent a number to his former aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, in New York, as well as Henry Knox and John Jay, who had been Secretary of War in the Confederation and Secretary for Foreign Affairs in the Articles of Confederation. Gouverneur Morris wrote from Philadelphia. John Langdon from New Hampshire. James McHenry from Maryland. Jonathan Trumbull, Washington's secretary from 1781 to 1783 from Connecticut. This is where Washington got his information. He knew people everywhere. And this is Heideking's contribution. I'm going to read this paragraph because I think it's incredible. The role of clearinghouses, hubs in the news network, where information was gathered and disseminated, was assumed principally by James Madison, Henry Knox, and Tench Coxe of Philadelphia. Madison's output of correspondence, 160 letters to 24 addresses between September 1787 and December 1789, Heideking points out, is even more astounding in light of the fact that he authored at least 29 Publius essays during that same period. He was writing the Federalist Papers, 29 of them. Plus, he gave several speeches in the ratifying convention in Richmond. He conducted an election campaign in which he ran for Congress against James Monroe for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so Madison's output is incredible. Absolutely incredible. 160 letters to 24 different people. Very extensive letters, because as author of the Constitution, he was able to explain elements of it that other people just weren't able to do. Some of his letters, talking about Madison again, some of his letters were composed at the seat of Congress in New York, some in Virginia's capital city of Richmond, others at his family plantation in Orange County. Most were addressed to Washington, 43 of them. Edmund Randolph, 21 letters. Thomas Jefferson, 20 letters. Tench Coxe, 11. Edmund Pendleton, 10. Hamilton and Rufus King, 8 letters each. Madison received the most mail from Carrington in Virginia, 24, and Tench Coxe in Philadelphia, 23. And then he names others who frequently sent letters to Madison. I think that this is an incredible contribution to our understanding of this period, because it demonstrates, better than anything I've ever seen, the extent to which the Federalists were communicating with each other. This is evidence of the communication and organizational advantage that the Federalists enjoyed over the Anti-Federalists. But the output is incredible. If you've ever read one of the Federalist papers, Federalist 10 or any other one, and you read the quality and the caliber of the writing, Madison authored 29 of those. Most of the rest of them were authored by Hamilton. John Jay only did a few. I think he did about 7. And they were at the very beginning. John Jay's primarily area of expertise was foreign policy. And so most of the Federalist papers at the very beginning talked about America's role in the world and why the reform reflected in the Constitution was so important in terms of America's respect throughout the rest of the world from other nations. That was John Jay's strength. Most of those occurred at the very beginning. So most of John Jay's contributions to the Federalist Papers are somewhere between papers number 1 and number 9. I think he writes the first 5. And then Madison writes 1, and then John Jay writes 2, et cetera, et cetera. So I think he's the author of about 7. And most of the foreign policy stuff is John Jay's. 29 of the others are written by James Madison. There are 85 Federalist Papers. That means Hamilton wrote about 50 of them. That is incredible if you've looked at the quality. Of course, these guys, that's what they did. They wrote and they knew this stuff. I mean, they lived this stuff. But it is just amazing to me, the output in the organization. But I think one of the contributions that Heideking has made is we can talk about the advantages they had, the organizational advantages they had, the communication advantages they had, the networking that was underway, that the Anti-Federalists were hard put to compete with. But I think these numbers give it to us. The letters that I'm most familiar with, because in doing my research, I was particularly interested in the exchange of letters between Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson was in France. And so the time between letters and the answers sometimes is fairly extensive. It took a long time to communicate across the ocean. And usually the opening line was, no matter whether it was Madison's letter or whether it was Jefferson's, the opening lines usually was something like, yours of the 23rd last, or something like that, just came to my attention today. And it'll probably refer to a letter that the other person, whether it's Madison or Jefferson, had written 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago. And so a lot of times when you get the letter, you almost have to go back to the original in order to see what the original said in order to understand the answer in this one, because it's a back and forth communication between these two. But the reason that I found these particularly interesting is because they are so extensive. These guys are word masters, and their correspondence is incredibly informative. And within their letter, there's a lot of tidbits, a lot of history, a lot of pieces of information thrown in the middle that you would miss, that many people would miss. But that's what Heidecking has done. How many times did Jefferson write Madison? How many times did Madison write back, and vice versa? The exchange between them on the need for the Bill of Rights, for example. At the very beginning, Madison is adamantly opposed to the need for a Bill of Rights. Jefferson is willing to put his reputation on the line against the Constitution until it has a Bill of Rights. And, you know, I think that this is very, very solid information, because it speaks to a very important aspect of ratification, and that is the degree to which the Federalists were able to design and develop and implement strategy, conscious strategy, in order to meet the enemy, so to speak, which was in order to counter criticisms of the Constitution coming from some very articulate and competent people. And I think I introduced one last week in the person of Luther Martin. Luther Martin's Genuine Information, which is a compilation of his analysis of the Constitution, the letters and the pieces that he wrote primarily in the Maryland newspapers, but they are so good that they are picked up by a number of other anti-Federalist newspapers around the country. Luther Martin is depicted by Federalists as an alcoholic. I mean, obviously, he is an alcoholic. I don't think there's any question. But that fact does not for a second deny the quality of the political and philosophical analysis of the Constitution that Luther Martin is able to provide. Luther Martin's understanding of the issues, his understanding of the past, his familiarity with Cato's letters and with the classics and all of this is astounding. He writes beautifully. So in a sense, basing most of the mention of Luther Martin on the fact that he's an alcoholic is a strategy, clearly is a strategy to reduce the impact of Luther Martin's mind. Very honestly, and I think we need to know this, that you don't find oftentimes a direct effort to refute what somebody like Luther Martin has said. You don't need to. If you can take care of Luther Martin in one fell swoop by just pointing out that he's an alcoholic, and half of the time what he writes is just the ravings of a semi-sober human being, then effectively what you've done is you've denied Luther Martin the credibility that he would need from his audience. And I think that's very, very important.
After an interruption in our connection to Dr. Bill, we have reconnected, and here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob, and I apologize for that. We've had an interruption, and we're having some pretty powerful weather here in southern West Virginia. We had an incredible storm last night. The internet was down for half the day, so I think that may be an explanation for our problems. But we're at 42 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 15 minutes or so left in our program today. So let me try to bring this particular issue to a logical conclusion. We were talking about Luther Martin. I was talking specifically about Luther Martin. My exposure to Luther Martin is principally because he was so influential in the Maryland ratification campaign. As a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from Maryland, who became disenchanted with the Constitution that was being drafted and basically bolted the convention, came back to Baltimore and was basically laying the groundwork for the anti-federalist opposition to the Constitution even before the convention ended in September of 1787. So Luther Martin was off and running. By the time the Constitution came out of the convention as a complete document, Luther Martin was already writing extensively on what was wrong with it and alerting the people as to what they were trying to do and what to expect and all of that. The point that I'm making is that Federalists did not take him on directly. I always believed that as the more I read, the more I was convinced that Luther Martin's abilities and skills, the depth of his analysis, was very honestly probably more profound, stronger than was that of many of his opponents. And the fact of the matter is, rather than taking Luther Martin on the substance of what he was saying, his critics focused principally on the fact that he was an alcoholic. And they basically set out to destroy Luther Martin's credibility by attacking the man, not focusing on his ideas. And that always bothered me for a long time. But I finally ended up concluding that it speaks more than anything else to the substance and the quality and the caliber of Luther Martin's ability to politically analyze and understand some of the issues that are going on. But the point that I wanted to make here is that this goes back to what we were talking about more than an hour ago about not taking seriously the content or the substance of people's writing once you understand who the author is. In other words, if you can attack or demean the credibility of your opponent, then it's never even necessary to deal with the content of what your opponent is saying, if that makes sense. Just by attacking the person and attacking his credibility, you are making it more likely than not that people will never read and take seriously what this person is saying. And that's what history has done to Luther Martin. I think that's incredibly important. And it goes back to at the beginning of today's program when we were looking at the quotes of Thomas Jefferson and Chairman Mao and pointing out how similar the two statements are. But the minute you see Mao Zedong's name on that second quotation, you are almost guaranteeing that people will react to who wrote it and never really deal with the substance of what he wrote. And the article that we looked at yesterday called Where You Are Shapes Who We Are is probably most evident in this fact. I think that the way that Maryland Federalists dealt with Luther Martin kind of is an indicator of the extent to which many of us are pre-programmed to respond positively or negatively to a particular person's point of view before we even know what that point of view is. It's the reason why some of us automatically turn on Fox News, while others of us turn on MSNBC. Because we have a prejudice, positive or negative, going in. And depending on which of those two networks we tune in on, we are more likely to respond positively to what we hear on one particular network than we are on another. And I think that that's powerful and important, because it speaks volumes about our education system. It goes all the way back to what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the 1770s in his General Diffusion of Knowledge. He wanted the substance of curriculum during the first 3 years of universal education to be based on history. And it's very obvious, if these are the first 3 years of children's education, then you're not dealing with the kind of sophisticated readers and thinkers that are going to be able to think through and understand this stuff. What you are doing instead is programming students to respond to particular cues, to particular hints, or names, or whatever. It's kind of like the IRS flagging Tea Party applications for tax-free status under the income tax laws. You basically look at the group, and you conclude from that, you already conclude that you know what's in it without reading it because of who wrote it. And therefore, you reject it, perhaps out of hand, mainly because of who wrote it, not what it says. And we have an education system that basically integrates or builds into our learning process in this country, I think. That kind of efficiency. You can save yourself the trouble. You can go read the summary. You don't have to read all these articles on a particular subject. Just read what Wikipedia says. And unlike many people, I'm not that opposed to Wikipedia. I think it's a tremendously valuable resource. But the point I'm trying to make is we oftentimes make our decision in ways that we believe to be efficient and accurate, but in a sense, it never gets us down to the kinds of skill development that we really need in order to constitute the kind of education that our founders talked so glowingly about. The quote from the Roman Republic, from Addison's play on Cato. It's very very important that our students be able to read and understand and develop the kinds of skills necessary to be able to do the kind of work and handle the kind of rigor that substantive quality higher education is going to demand of them. And I would suggest that many of our students come into this situation totally unprepared because they've been pretty much programmed to respond to cues like who wrote it, rather than to respond substantively to the content. And that's the value of primary source material, because what you're doing is asking people to read the substance of the original. You're not reading what people say about it. You're not reading the thoughts of somebody who supports it or does not support it. You are reading the actual thoughts themselves. And if you had no idea who Mao Zedong was and no idea who Thomas Jefferson was, you would find those two paragraphs and assume if they weren't written by the same person, they were probably written by people who believed and thought the same. And if anybody heard me say that Thomas Jefferson and Mao Zedong thought the same, they would be offended. My point is, one shouldn't be. I think it's incredibly significant. Let me suggest one other factor here. As we're getting close to the conclusion of our program today, and I really don't want to get into the Bill Keller piece out of the New York Times at this point because there's not enough time to do justice to it, so I'll hold it perhaps until tomorrow. But there's one other point that I want to make. I think it's an observation, but I think it's worth at least considering. And it's tied in with this idea of responding to cues and all the rest of it. It seems to me that that's the difference in levels of education that we expect from different people depending on who they are. Many of you are probably very familiar with there's been a whole slew of research that's come out within the last week or so on education. There was a major article in yesterday's New York Times about research to show that the bulk of America's spending on education was primarily going into the education of the wealthy, of the few. That we were really pouring resources into their education, but we were not pouring it into the educational quality of the vast number of Americans who need that quality. In a sense, our education system and the way we put money into it is skewed. And my reaction to that, well, first of all, I found the research interesting, but it's not totally surprising. It makes perfect sense. Because in our society, the whole idea of our education system is to weed out the incompetent in order to focus our resources on the most competent. Our education system, by definition, is competitive. It's modeled on Jefferson's idea that you create universal education for the first 3 years. You require everybody to be in the same class, and then you come along on a regular basis and skim the cream of ability off the top. And the assumption is if you create a competitive situation, the cream will rise to the top, and you just skim it off, and that's your those are your most talented, the most talented people. And that's the model. And that's the model that we've adhered to in our educational system pretty much ever since. And so the idea is you don't waste your resources on people that cannot benefit from the quality of the education you're going to provide. So what you try to do is weed them out and then put most of your resources into the people who can take most advantage of those resources. Your brightest, i.e., those from the wealthiest backgrounds. So the research does not really tell us something that we didn't really know. In fact, what it does is reinforce things we already knew. Our whole education system from the beginning was stacked in favor of the wealthy and the well-prepared. And we are paying the price for it now in terms of the way we stand in terms of quality education with the rest of the world. We have got to basically go back to the drawing board and begin again. We have got to address the idea of educating everybody, not just the few. We are now in the kind of a world where educating the few, 1 out of every 5 people, is not going to cut it. But it makes perfect sense that the research being done about where the resources have been put have primarily gone to the wealthy. That's the way we see the nature of the beast. That's the way the system makes sense to us. Our whole system of standardized testing and everything else is designed to separate the few from the many. The idea being, with limited resources, we can't afford to waste them on people who are not able to benefit from them. Therefore, we will withhold our resources until after we weed out the most incompetent, and then we'll be spending our resources on the people who can take most advantage of them. That's the way we've seen it. That's the way we've always looked at it. I would suggest that we can no longer continue to look at our education system that way. So I think that that is very, very important. And I think this idea of responding to cues and educating people to respond to cues and take seriously the thoughts of those we agree with and not take seriously the thoughts of those who don't has been programmed, has been integrated into our education system right from the very beginning. It's one of the things we have to shake, and we must change if we're going to give all of our students a fair chance. I would suggest that's really what the substance of bringing true equality of opportunity to our education process is all about. It's 58 minutes after the hour. We've reached the end of our day. I apologize for the interruptions today. One of the things that we're going to spend some time doing is building in a protection so that we don't get people hacking into our program in the middle, uninvited, as it were. Because I'm not as sophisticated enough to know what to do except to shut the thing down and reboot it, start all over again. So we'll clean these things up and we'll continue to plug along. I invite you to stay tuned now for Bob Kincaid's program on the Head On Radio Network. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien, and I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and I want to invite you to be back with us again tomorrow. Thank you.